There's a kind of wisdom out there, a hard one knowing that don't come from textbooks or TED Talks. It's forged in the fire of failure, hammered out on the anvil of regret, etched into the very soul when a man's brought low, when he's eaten dirt and stared down the barrel of his own mistakes. It's the kind of truth that makes you stop dead in your tracks, look at the wreckage you've made, and finally, truly learn. It's a bitter pill, that lesson, but sometimes it's the only one strong enough to save you. Eugene was a man who knew that truth intimately. 45 years old, though some mornings, looking at the deep-set lines around his eyes, you might have guessed a few more. He worked the night shift at the old metal stamping plant down by the river, the same one his father had worked, then his father before him. The air in there always smelled of hot oil and cold steel, a scent that clung to Eugene's clothes and he sometimes thought to his very bones. He wasn't a loud man, Eugene. Never had been, even when he tried to be. These days, he moved with a quiet, almost deliberate purpose, like every step had been considered, every action weighed. His face, weathered by years and the invisible burdens he carried, rarely showed much, yet his eyes missed nothing. They were observant eyes, always scanning, always taking in the small details others overlooked. When he gave you a firm handshake, a genuine nod often followed, a silent acknowledgement that he'd truly seen you, truly heard whatever few words you offered. But he wasn't one to initiate the chatter. He let the world come to him, absorbing it, processing it, an unassuming presence in the clatter and roar of the factory floor. His hands, thick and strong, told their own story. Calloused, scarred from a lifetime of gripping tools, feeding unforgiving sheets of metal into hungry machines. But beneath the toughness, there was a certain carefulness, a precision born of necessity. They were the hands of a man who'd built things, fixed things, yes, but also the hands of a man who'd once held onto everything he loved with a desperate, failing grip. You could see it in the way he handled a coffee mug, or the quiet patience with which he tied his work boots each morning. A man who understood the fragile nature of things, and the immense effort it took to keep them from shattering. He carried a quiet strength now, forged in a fire he rarely spoke about, a persistence that hummed beneath his surface like a low, steady engine. It was a life measured not by grand events, but by the relentless ticking of a clock radio set for 5:00 a.m. Every morning, the same tinny jingle would drag Eugene from the shallow depths of sleep. He'd swing his feet to the worn linoleum, the chill a familiar jolt, and find his way to the kitchen, the soft glow of the fridge light illuminating the quiet house. A quick kiss to Sarah's forehead as he left the bedroom, a silent prayer that she might get a few more precious minutes of rest before the kids started stirring. His world was the drone of the factory machines, the clang of metal on metal, the pervasive smell of oil and sweat. 8 hours, sometimes 10, of the same precise movements, feeding the beast, shaping raw materials into something new, something useful. He was good at it, methodical, his movements economical and efficient, honed by years. But there was no joy in it, only the grim satisfaction of a job done, another day earned. The drive home, the gray light of dawn slowly giving way to morning, then fading into dusk. Always the same route, past the rows of identical houses, the quiet desperation of a working-class neighborhood hanging in the air like exhaust fumes. At home, the bills were a constant, nagging presence on the kitchen table, envelopes with red notices, the water bill, the electric, the rising cost of groceries. Sarah, his rock, would meticulously go through them, her brow furrowed, her lips moving silently as she calculated, stretched, made do. Eugene watched her, the guilt a familiar, bitter taste. Every extra shift, every overtime hour was a quiet apology, an unspoken promise to make things right, to shore up the foundations he had so carelessly crumbled. Beneath the surface of this quiet, persistent man, a different Eugene still pulsed, a ghost from another life. He saw it sometimes in the eyes of younger men at the factory, full of bright, impossible ideas, convinced they held the key to unlocking something grand. He used to be that guy. An impulsive dreamer, chasing the next big, flashy idea, convinced he was a genius, special, destined for something more than the factory floor. He'd talk big, draw diagrams on napkins, filling the air with the intoxicating scent of ambition. He'd ignore Sarah's cautious questions, his father-in-law's gruff, practical advice. They just didn't get it, he'd told himself, blinded by the sheer brilliance of his own vision. That was before the invention. Before he'd poured their entire life savings, every cent, into a surefire contraption that was supposed to revolutionize, well, everything. He could still see it in his mind's eye, the gleaming prototype, the patent applications, the confident pitches. He remembered the grand pronouncements, the swagger in his step. And then the silence The slow, agonizing realization that it didn't work. Not really. The spectacular failure not just of a machine, but of a dream, of a man's judgment. It had left them not just broke, but deeply, irrevocably in debt, his wife heartbroken, her faith in him shattered, their future hanging by a thread he had cut himself. He carried that weight every single day, the shame a phantom limb that ached constantly. The quiet strength he now possessed was merely a scar tissue built over a gaping wound of foolish arrogance. His deep-seated fear of returning to financial ruin wasn't abstract. It was a memory, sharp and vivid, a nightmare he'd lived through. It made him overly cautious now, prone to overthinking, especially when a new opportunity, however small, presented itself. The burning ambition was still there, a low ember, but it was buried under layers of caution and a fierce, almost desperate loyalty to his family. He defailed them once spectacularly. He swore he'd rather die than do it again. The final straw wasn't a lightning bolt, but a slow, agonizing crack like ice beneath heavy boots. He'd come home from an extra shift, the usual metallic tang of the factory still clinging to his clothes. The house was too quiet. He pushed open the door, expecting the usual comforting chaos of Emily's pop music and Michael's video games. Instead, he found Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, a single, stark white envelope resting precisely in the center of the worn formica. Her back was to him, her shoulders slumped, her usually meticulous hair a little disheveled. He knew before he even saw the stark red letters, the word eviction screaming silently from the page. His stomach dropped like a stone down a well. He walked around the table slowly, each step echoing in the oppressive quiet. When she finally looked up, her eyes weren't angry. They were empty, lifeless, betrayed. Not a single tear fell, but her face was a landscape of utter despair. It was the deepest wound he had ever inflicted, far beyond the lost money or the broken dreams. He had stripped them bare not just of their security, but of their trust, their hope, their very sense of belonging. His ego, his inability to listen, his blindness to everything but his own supposed genius, it had cost them everything. And looking into those vacant, broken eyes, he saw the full, horrifying magnitude of his arrogance. It was a complete, brutal breakdown, not just of their finances, but of him. He stood there for a long time, the silence stretching taut between them, thick with unshed tears and unspoken accusations. Sarah eventually rose, her movements slow, deliberate, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. She didn't look at him again, didn't say a word, just walked past him, a ghost in her own home, and disappeared into the bedroom, closing the door with a softness that was more devastating than a slam. Eugene remained, staring at the envelope, the brutal finality of it. His big idea, his grand vision, had dissolved into this. Ash, and he was the arsonist. The mornings that followed, and there were so many of them, started not with the shrill insistency of the alarm clock, but with a cold knot in Eugene's stomach. The digital red numbers on the clock radio would blink 4:58 a.m., 2 minutes before the actual ring, and his eyes would already be open, staring at the darkened ceiling. Sarah would be a still, unmoving shape beside him, her back always turned. The warmth of her body was there, a physical presence, but the emotional chasm between them had widened into an unbridgeable gulf. He'd swing his legs out of bed, the floorboards groaning a protest under his weight. A quick shower, the water never quite hot enough to chase away the chill that had settled deep in his bones. Downstairs, the kitchen was his domain in those early hours. The coffee maker hissed and gurgled, a lonely mechanical breath in the quiet house. He'd pour himself a mug, black and strong, the bitter taste a fitting start to his day. No breakfast, just the coffee and the silence. Sometimes he'd catch his reflection in the dark window pane, a ghost in his own life, a man who looked like he was constantly bracing for a punch he knew was coming. 45 years old, and he felt closer to 70. The drive to the factory was a blur of pre-dawn streets and the dull thrum of his old pickup. The radio stayed off. His mind, however, was a relentless broadcast of worries. Emily needed new shoes. Michael was outgrowing his bike. The car made a new clunking noise he couldn't afford to investigate. And always, always the phantom weight of that eviction notice, a lead ball chained to his ankle, dragging him down. He'd park in the sprawling gravel lot, the concrete monolith of the plant looming against the lightening sky, its smokestacks exhaling thick gray breath into the morning. Inside, the air was a constant assault of metal on metal, the high-pitched whine of machinery, the rhythmic clang of presses. He worked the line, the same line, for over 2 decades. Bolts, washers, widgets. His hands, calloused and strong, moved with an automatic precision born of repetition. He'd install the component, check the fit, tighten it down. Thousands of times a day. His muscles ached, his ears rang, and his mind drifted not to dreams, but to the bills waiting on the kitchen counter, to the quiet tension that hung in the air at home, to the almost imperceptible flinch Sarah gave when he accidentally brushed her hand. He used to have dreams, wild, sprawling things. He remembered the feeling not so long ago of that burning spark, that conviction he had that he was different, destined for more than just turning wrenches on an assembly line. He'd spend his evenings not so long ago hunched over sketches in the garage, the faint smell of sawdust and solder filling the air. He had felt like an inventor, a visionary, a man on the cusp of changing the world, or at least his family's world. He'd been so sure, so utterly, arrogantly sure. That feeling, that dangerous, intoxicating sense of genius, it was a phantom limb now. It ached, a deep, hollow throb, a constant reminder of how spectacularly wrong he had been. The gap between the man he was then, the impulsive dreamer, the self-proclaimed genius, and the man he was now, a tired factory worker drowning in debt and shame, felt like an uncrossable canyon. Every turn of a wrench, every clatter on the line, every blank stare from Sarah, it all echoed the same brutal truth. He was a failure. The eviction notice wasn't just about losing the house, it was about losing himself. The man he thought he was, the future he thought he'd build, it was all gone. Replaced by a crushing anxiety that pulsed behind his eyes, a desperate fear that he would never escape this gray, grinding existence, that he had condemned his family to it, and that he deserved every agonizing minute. The ghost of his ambition, once a guiding light, now just pointed to the wreckage of his past, a constant, silent accusation. And the worst part, he knew it was all true. It was a Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday, the days blurred together when you were just waiting for the next punch to the gut. He remembered the precise thwack the envelope made as it slid through the mail slot. It sounded heavier than usual, a thick, official sort of sound. Sarah was out, picking up Emily from school. Michael was probably in his room, lost in a video game, blissfully unaware of the silent storm brewing. Eugene picked it up from the floor. No return address, just a cold, official-looking window. A sick dread settled in his stomach, turning his insides to ice. He knew, he just knew. His fingers, usually so steady with a wrench, fumbled as he tore the flap. The words inside weren't flowery or apologetic. They were stark, legal, final. Notice of eviction. 60 days. Then 30, then out. His eyes scanned the small print, but the big, bold letters screamed. He sank onto the bottom step of the stairs, the paper trembling in his hand, the world tilting precariously on its axis. He heard the front door open, the familiar jingle of Sarah's keys, Emily's cheerful chatter. Their voices, usually a comfort, now felt like daggers. He shoved the paper under a pile of junk mail, hoping to buy himself a few more minutes, a few more breaths before the bomb dropped. "Eugene, you home, honey?" Sarah's voice, tired but warm, reached him from the entryway. "Yeah, just came in," he managed, his voice a gravelly whisper he barely recognized. She walked into the living room, Emily trailing behind, tossing her backpack onto the floor with the unconcerned abandon of youth. Sarah caught sight of him, still on the step, pale, rigid. Her eyes narrowed, trained on his hands. He tried to hide the slight tremor, but she saw it. She always saw it. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice losing its warmth, sharpening with an edge he knew too well. The edge of suspicion, of dread, a weary resignation. He couldn't speak. He just slowly, painfully pulled the crumpled paper from under the junk mail. Her gaze fell on it, then lifted to his face, and that was it. The crack, it wasn't a scream, not a shout. It was worse. It was the sound of a woman's breath catching, a small, choked gasp that held more despair than any wail. Her eyes, usually so full of gentle understanding, hardened into pools of utter betrayal. They looked at him not with anger, but with a profound, soul-deep exhaustion, as if every ounce of hope she'd ever held for him, for them, had just evaporated. Emily, sensing the shift in the air, had stopped smiling. Michael, drawn by the silence, stood in the doorway of his room, looking lost, small. "Eugene," Sarah said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "What have you done now?" It wasn't a question. It was an indictment, a condemnation. And in that moment, seeing the security of his family, the quiet dignity of their home, crumbling around them because of him, because of his unchecked ego, his grand schemes, his inability to just listen, a wall inside him crumbled too. It was a complete, shattering breakdown. The weight of his arrogance, once a badge of honor, now pressed down on him, suffocating. He had not only cost them everything, but he had broken her trust, their security, their future. And he felt utterly, completely, irrevocably lost. The silence that followed stretched into an eternity. Sarah went to the kitchen, started dinner as if nothing had happened, but her movements were stiff, her back rigid. Emily disappeared into her room. Michael, a ghost of a child, went back to his games, the faint electronic chirps from his room a stark contrast to the heavy quiet elsewhere. Eugene stayed on the step, the eviction notice a crumpled ball in his fist. He felt nothing but a vast, empty ache. He moved eventually like a zombie to the garage. He didn't turn on the light. Just sat on his usual stool, surrounded by the ghosts of his ambition, the half-finished prototypes, the tools he'd bought with borrowed money, the dusty blueprints of a future that would never be. Hours later, long after Sarah had gone to bed without a word, without even looking at him, he was still there. The house was asleep. The streetlights cast long, skeletal shadows through the grimy window. It was 3 a.m., the witching hour, the hour of brutal honesty. He was a failure. Not just financially, but as a husband, as a father, as a man. His grand ideas, they were nothing but expensive delusions. His confidence, arrogance, his passion, selfishness. He had convinced himself he was a genius, special, different. But all he had done was chase shiny objects, ignore the warning signs, and drag his family down with him into the dirt. He pictured Sarah's face again, that look of utter despair and betrayal. It wasn't anger he saw there anymore, but a deep, unfixable crack in her spirit, a weariness he had put there. He had broken her. He had broken them. And for what? For a fleeting dream that dissolved into dust and debt. He gripped the cold metal stool, knuckles white. The bite into his palms was the only real thing in that moment. Every single choice he'd made, every piece of advice he'd ignored, every time he'd puffed out his chest and declared he knew best, it all came back to haunt him. He had been so blind, so deaf, so utterly convinced of his own brilliance that he hadn't seen the cliff edge until he was already falling, dragging everyone he loved with him. He deserved this. Every ounce of this crushing weight, every sleepless night, every bill that piled up. He had gambled their lives away on his ego, and now the house of cards had fallen, exposing him for what he truly was. A man who had squandered everything, a man who couldn't be trusted, a man who had broken the most precious thing in his life, the faith of his family. The bitterness was a physical taste in his mouth, the shame a burning coal in his gut. There was no escaping it, no hiding from it. This was his reality. This was the wreckage he had made. The taste of ash and failure filled his mouth, a bitter poison. He sat there, not moving, not crying, just existing in the vast, cold space of his own catastrophic making. The only sound was the distant hum of the old refrigerator, a steady, indifferent drone that felt like a mockery. Outside, the night was still, the rest of the world asleep, unaware of the quiet implosion happening in this kitchen. A faint light from the street lamp cast long shadows across the floor, making the familiar space seem alien, hostile. He looked at his hands, calloused from years of factory work, hands that had built things, fixed things, provided for his family. Now they felt useless, clumsy, the very instruments of his downfall. He saw Sarah's face again, superimposed over the dingy kitchen counter, her eyes hollow. It was a vision he knew would haunt him until his dying day, a permanent brand on his soul. And in that profound, suffocating silence, something shifted. It wasn't a roar or a sudden epiphany like in the movies. It was quieter than that, a deep, resonant thunk somewhere in the core of him. Like a heavy door finally slamming shut, closing off the path he'd been on, the path of the impulsive dreamer, the self-proclaimed genius. Enough, just enough. The word wasn't spoken, not even thought with an exclamation point. It simply settled, a heavy stone in the pit of his stomach. Enough of the chasing, enough of the grand ideas, enough of the ignoring, enough of the hurt. He didn't know what enough actually meant for his future, not yet. He had no plan, no brilliant solution forming in the shattered pieces of his mind. All he knew was that the Eugene who had made these choices, who had caused this pain, that man was gone. He had to be. He simply could not continue living like this, could not continue watching the light drain from the eyes of the people he loved most. The pain was too great, the shame too profound, the cost too high. The next morning, the factory whistle shrieked its usual 5 a.m. summons, dragging him from a shallow, restless sleep. He felt like he hadn't slept at all. Every bone ached, his head throbbed, and a thick fog still clung to his brain. The world felt muted, a watercolor painting smeared by rain. He went through the motions, the ritual of coffee and toast, the careful movements to avoid waking Sarah or the kids. But something was different. The weight hadn't lifted, but it had changed. It was no longer a crushing, passive despair. It was a heavy, cold reminder. A fuel, he clocked in, the fluorescent lights of the assembly line buzzing overhead, a familiar drone that used to just be noise. Today, it was the soundtrack to a new resolve. As he gripped the torque wrench, tightening bolts on another engine block, he felt the familiar, rhythmic thud of the machinery. He worked, his mind a quiet hum of its own. His first step, the very first, wasn't some grand business plan or an audacious new invention. It was excruciatingly small, almost invisible. He decided he needed to understand exactly how deep the hole was, not just broadly, but precisely. The shame made his stomach clench, but he forced himself to do it. During his lunch break, instead of heading to the break room for a quick bite in the sports section, he pulled out a crumpled envelope from his pocket. Inside were all the bills, the notices, the looming threats he'd been too proud, too scared to truly face. He found a quiet corner near the loading dock, away from prying eyes. With a borrowed pen and the back of an old delivery slip, he started writing. Every single debt, every overdue amount. The mortgage, the car payment, the credit cards, the loan for the failed invention, the smaller, forgotten bills. He listed them meticulously, line by painful line. His hand trembled. Each number was a fresh cut, a stark, undeniable testament to his catastrophic failure. He felt the old impulse, the familiar urge to crumple the paper, to shove it back in the envelope, to pretend it didn't exist, to escape. But then he remembered Sarah's face, the eviction notice. The quiet enough. He swallowed hard, his throat dry and tight. This wasn't about genius. This wasn't about big ideas. This was about cold, hard facts. This was about humility. This was about listening to the undeniable truth of his situation, even when it screamed his inadequacies. He kept writing. The total grew larger and larger, a sickening sum that felt impossible to overcome. A cold sweat broke out on his brow. It was worse than he'd thought. Far, far worse. He didn't finish it all that day. The numbers blurred, the weight became too much to bear in one sitting. But he had started. He had faced the first, most terrifying demon, the full, unvarnished truth of his financial ruin, and he hadn't run. He had put the pen down, folded the slip carefully, and put it back in the envelope. The shame still burned, but beneath it, a tiny, almost imperceptible spark had ignited. He had taken the first step not towards a dream, but away from a nightmare. He had started by listening, not to a sales pitch, but to the brutal honesty of his own worst failure. The morning after, the heavy weight of that half-finished ledger of ruin still sat on Eugene's chest like a stone. He went to work, punched the clock, operated the heavy machinery, his mind a million miles away, replaying numbers, replaying Sarah's face. He knew he had to go back to it. Day 3 came, and with it, a gnawing dread. When he got home, the kids were doing homework at the kitchen table. Sarah was making dinner, the familiar smells of onion and garlic filling the air. It was a picture of normalcy, a fragile piece that he felt he was constantly on the verge of shattering. He ate in silence, nodding occasionally, forcing a smile when Emily asked about his day. The truth, the monstrous truth he was trying to tame in his spare room, felt like a betrayal to this quiet domestic scene. Later, when the house was quiet, he slipped into his makeshift office, the old wooden desk scarred with decades of use. The envelope sat there, waiting. He picked up the pen. His hand felt heavy, unwilling. He knew deep down that finishing this list meant confronting not just the numbers, but the complete, utter foolishness of his past. It meant admitting, finally, unequivocally, that he wasn't the genius he'd always thought he was. That he was just a man who'd messed up badly. He started writing again. The credit card from the initial research and development for the invention, the materials for the prototype, the marketing push he'd been so sure would launch them to stardom. Each line item wasn't just a number, it was a memory of his hubris, a ghost of a decision he couldn't unmake. He kept going until the sum stared back at him, an astronomical figure that made his stomach clench. He leaned back in his creaking chair, the room spinning slightly. It wasn't just debt, it was a mountain, an Everest of his own making. "This is impossible," he whispered into the silent room. The old Eugene, the one who'd chased shiny objects, would have crumpled the paper, thrown it in the trash, and started looking for another get-rich-quick scheme to escape this reality. He felt the pull, the familiar siren song of avoidance. Just ignore it, Eugene. Something will come along, something always does. But something hadn't. Something had led him to an eviction notice and the profound despair in his wife's eyes. He closed his eyes, the memory sharp and unforgiving. No, he wouldn't run this time. Not again. He wouldn't subject Sarah and the kids to that kind of fear ever again. That burning shame, that absolute rock bottom, was now his compass. Next few days blurred into a monotonous grind, both at the factory and at home. He called the first creditor. It was a credit card company, polite but firm. He felt a blush creep up his neck as he mumbled about his situation. They offered a payment plan, a ridiculously low minimum that barely touched the interest. It felt like shouting into a hurricane. He hung up, deflated. The old feeling of inadequacy washed over him. "See, it's hopeless. You tried." Day 7. He sat down again, staring at the total. He'd done the hard part, listed it all. Now what? He felt a deep, debilitating paralysis. He'd wanted to be a genius, a visionary. Now he was just a man trying to figure out how to pay off a mountain of debt, one painfully small step at a time. This wasn't glamorous. This wasn't exciting. This was just hard, soul-crushing hard. He found himself staring at the phone, the numbers for the next few creditors intimidating him. He started to make excuses in his head. Too late to call? Too early? What would I even say? He walked out to the garage, the familiar smell of oil and sawdust a brief comfort. He picked up an old wrench, turning it over in his hand. This was his world, predictable, tangible. He understood machines. He understood how a broken part needed a specific fix, how a process had to be followed. Why couldn't his life be like that? Then it hit him. Maybe it could be. He wasn't a genius inventor, no, but he was methodical, he was persistent. He'd worked on that factory floor for years, doing the same repetitive tasks, solving small, incremental problems day in and day out. He'd shown up. He'd kept going. He went back inside, his jaw set. He picked up the phone again. He dialed the number for the next credit card company, a smaller one this time. His voice was still shaky, but a little firmer. He explained. He listened. He took notes. They offered a slightly better plan. It was still a drop in the bucket, but it was something, a step. A foot forward on that long, daunting path. Days turned into a grueling routine. Wake up early, go to work. Come home, eat with family, then retreat to his quiet battleground. Each call was a small victory. Each new detail learned about managing debt, a tiny chip off the mountain. There were days he wanted to throw the phone across the room. Days he felt the old familiar shame burn so hot he wanted to curl up and disappear. He'd hear the echoes of past criticisms. The doubts in Sarah's voice from years ago, the unspoken judgment in his own head. One particularly bad evening, after a particularly frustrating call where he felt talked down to and dismissed, he slammed the phone onto the receiver. He leaned his head against the cool wall, breathing heavily. What's the point? This is going to take forever. I'm never going to dig us out of this hole. He felt the old impulse to just give up, to let the banks take everything, to just surrender to the crushing weight of it all. He thought of all the times he'd quit before, all the half-finished projects, the ideas he'd abandoned when they got tough. This was different. This wasn't about a project. This was about everything. He thought of Emily, soon to be applying for colleges. Michael, dreaming of a new bike. Sarah, who deserved better than the constant worry he'd inflicted upon her. He pictured the eviction notice again, the stark white paper against the worn wood of their door. He remembered the empty feeling in his gut, the raw terror. No, he wouldn't quit. Not this time. He couldn't afford to. The lesson was etched into his soul now. Slow down, listen. Listen to the creditors, listen to the brutal truth, listen to that quiet, persistent voice inside him that said keep going. He picked up the phone again, ready to research debt consolidation, ready to find another way, however small, to move forward. The shame was still there, a constant companion, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was becoming fuel. Weeks turned into a quiet, relentless grind. Eugene became a ghost in his own house after his factory shift, not out of despair, but out of a fierce, focused determination. The old, impulsive Eugene would have thrown himself into a frantic, flashy new scheme, convinced he could invent his way out of trouble. This new Eugene, the one forged in the bitter fire of failure, did the opposite. He slowed down. He listened. He read every line of every bill, every clause in every agreement. He called the debt collectors back, not to argue, but to understand. He spoke softly, clearly, offering what he could, asking for extensions, proving his earnestness not with grand promises, but with consistent, small payments and meticulous record-keeping. Sarah watched him, wary at first. The silence in the house, broken only by the low murmur of his conversations or the rustle of papers, was different from the heavy silence of his past brooding. She'd catch him at the kitchen table late at night, a single lamp illuminating a ledger filled with neat figures, a calculator beside his elbow. He wasn't dreaming, he was calculating. He started making small changes at home, too. Fixing the leaky faucet himself, not just patching it, but taking the time to learn the plumbing properly from YouTube tutorials, applying the same methodical approach to household repairs that he now applied to his finances. He spent his Saturdays in the garage, not on some wild invention, but carefully sorting and organizing tools, building a sturdy workbench, making order out of chaos. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the tension in the house began to ease. A smaller bill arrived from the collection agency, reflecting a negotiated settlement. A phone call ended not with a frustrated sigh, but a quiet, satisfied nod. One evening, after he'd successfully haggled down an overdue medical bill by meticulously presenting their financial situation, he looked up to see Sarah standing in the doorway. She didn't say anything, just offered a small, tired smile, a fragile, precious thing, but a smile nonetheless. It was a silent acknowledgement, a tiny thread of trust beginning to reweave itself between them. The shame hadn't vanished, but it had shrunk, replaced by a quiet, determined pride in the hard, unglamorous work of simply getting things right. 5 years slipped by, not in a blur of excitement, but in a steady, methodical march forward. Eugene didn't strike gold. He mined it, one painstaking shovelful at a time. He never forgot the eviction notice, the look on Sarah's face. That memory was a cold, sharp stone in his pocket, a constant reminder to stay grounded. He didn't stop at merely paying off the old debts. He applied the same lessons of due diligence, patience, and careful observation to everything. He started small. While still at the factory, he noticed an unmet need in their working-class suburb. Quality, affordable, small engine repair. Most folks just threw out their broken lawnmowers or leaf blowers. Eugene, with his newly honed methodical approach and his organized garage workshop, saw an opportunity. He spent months researching parts suppliers, watching repair videos, practicing on discarded engines. He started charging modest rates, built a reputation for honest work and meticulous detail. He didn't advertise with flashy flyers, just word of mouth, one satisfied customer telling another. His wealth didn't come from a lottery ticket. It grew from the thousands of small, well-executed decisions. He meticulously saved a portion of every repair job, every extra hour at the factory. He researched local real estate with the same intensity he'd once poured into his failed invention, but this time he listened to experienced investors, not just his own ego. He bought a small, neglected duplex, fixed it up himself, applying his learned repair skills, and rented it out. Then another. He wasn't a millionaire, not in the flashy sense, but his family was secure. Their modest, single-story house was paid off. Emily was in her second year of college, studying nursing, her tuition covered. Michael had a new custom-built gaming PC, earned from helping his dad in the garage. Eugene still worked at the factory, though not because he had to. He found a quiet satisfaction in the routine, and he was good at it. He was still quiet, observant, but the weight was gone from his shoulders. His handshake remained firm, his nod sincere, but his eyes, though still carrying the echoes of past burdens, now held a clear, steady light of quiet strength. He was the same man, but fundamentally different. He'd learned to trust his own meticulous process, not his impulses. One sunny Saturday, a younger factory worker, Mark, was over, admiring Eugene's perfectly maintained lawnmower, which Eugene had just serviced himself. "Eugene," Mark said, "you always seem so solid, like nothing rattles you. How'd you get there?" Eugene paused, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He looked out across his tidy yard at his house, at the small, sturdy shed he'd built for his repair business tools. "Mark," he began, his voice low and thoughtful, "the biggest lessons ain't in the fancy books or the shiny speeches. They're in the dirt you eat when you mess up bad. My biggest screw-up, the one that nearly cost me everything I held dear, that taught me to slow down, to listen more than I talk, and to build on rock, not sand. And to always remember what it feels like to lose everything, so you don't ever do it again to the people you love." He nodded slowly, looking past Mark, seeing not just his yard, but the ghost of an eviction notice and the determined face of his wife. And so it is that sometimes the deepest wells of wisdom are found not in soaring triumphs, but in the desolate valleys of our worst mistakes. For Eugene, the man who lost everything, found his greatest wealth not in the accumulation of things, but in the quiet, enduring strength forged when a broken man finally learned to listen and to build. He wasn't a genius, but he became